Okay, so I want to go ahead and shift and think about hierarchy and prejudice in the church, specifically around gender discrimination. The next slide you'll notice is a slide that has a verse that's in 1 Corinthians 14. Now, this is traditionally Corinthians, and you guys will be reading this. Some of you are reading it for class today, and others of you are reading it for Wednesday. But Corinthians is traditionally understood to be a book that was written by Paul to the community at Corinth, to the Jesus followers at Corinth. Now, interestingly, this text is much like the later addition to Mark. And again, this is not something that you'll see in typically like in a King James version of the Bible. This is what you'll find in the NRSV and the commentary. Scholars notice that this doesn't actually sound like Paul, and so they realize that this was a later addition to the text. But here's what it reads. You can see this on this slide. As in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says, if there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Now, how do we also know that this is probably not Paul? Because there were leaders in these churches that were women, and these women were prophesying and teaching and speaking. So this excerpt was added later on. Now, why might it have been added later on, and by who? You're probably thinking what I'm thinking. It's added later on because it benefits who? Men. And what does it also do? Keeps women silent. So this then kind of also would sort of confirm or resonate with the idea that we saw presented in the Da Vinci Code last week. So I think it's important that we think about texts like this because they've been used within the church also to keep women out of positions of power. I think specifically of what's happened in the Catholic Church. There cannot be women priests, right? And the reason that there are not women priests for a number of reasons, but also because of texts like this that say that women should not even be permitted to speak or to teach within the church. What I want us to think about now is the connection between texts like this and what happens in society. So the Bible has been used, obviously, throughout time in many different societies and cultures through colonization to teach people how to often be a man or how to be a woman, and it also influences social structures. One of the ways that it influences social structures, I would say, specifically here in the United States, is with the gender wage gap, right? So I want you guys to take a look at this slide and to see the differences in the pay disparity between men and women. This is still in effect today, right? Often because women are not seen as valuable as men are, or as productive, right? And it's also specific to different roles and occupations, right? Some are traditionally seen as male, some are traditionally seen as female, and often females in roles that are traditionally male roles receive less pay. I also want you to look at that next slide that is dealing with intersectional inequality. So it's even worse for women of color, this pay disparity. And I want you guys to go through and look at those, at that graph and see the differences. What I'm really trying to get at and want you to think about, and the way that the Bible has been a part of these developing ideas of gender and inequity, that certain people should be in powers and others shouldn't, that certain people are chosen and others aren't, right? This influences the way that society has developed and the way that the society operates. Now, sociologists have come up with a term for this, and it's called cultural deficit theory. And what you'll see on this next slide is that I'm thinking about then cultural deficit theory and institutionalized racism. So often the victims of these inequities are blamed. So cultural deficit theory then blames peoples of color for their struggles within a racist society while obscuring larger structural barriers. So basically, for instance, then saying that certain people are just lazy, right? This is cultural deficit theory, seeing that these people just aren't as good as productive as valuable as. CDT, cultural deficit theory, also exempts dominant culture from the need to play any role in the eradication or the redress of racism, right? So instead of those people who are in positions of power actually taking responsibility, seeing this as a larger systemic issue, it excuses people from having to play any active role in reparations, in changing the way things are, right? So what I want us to think about is the way, in fact, that these things are institutionalized because we've been trained to think this way about certain people. I just messed this up. Hold on 1 second. So then what another way to think of it, another paradigm, is to think of racism then, and just like Islamophobia, just like homophobia, just like, right, as being something that is institutionalized because it's become so natural within our culture. We've become enculturated in a way in which we discriminate against people that are not a part of the dominant class or race or gender. So this is a way then, the way that we actually theorize these issues then also determines the way that we handle them and address them. So when we recognize historical, institutional, and cultural racism, the roots, the cause, the explanation, responses, and the solutions, they all look very differently, right? And so you can see here the difference then between equality and equity, realizing that we don't all start in the same place, and that some people do actually need certain benefits in order to even just come to a place where we are truly all where it's fair in many ways. So what I want you to do now is just to head to that next slide, and then we're gonna go from this slide to looking at Galatians 3. I talked briefly about intersectionality earlier. Intersectionality then represents an analytic framework that seeks to identify the ways in which interlocking systems of power influence those who are marginalized. Intersectionality considers that various forms of social stratification, right, where one group is over another, so stratification around gender, sexuality, race, class, ethnicity, religion, age, ability, right? These things don't exist independently. They're all working together within our society in the ways that we understand identity and how people operate in the world. They're interwoven. So what I want us to do is to think about then the way in which this text in Galatians 3 that we read for today speaks to the fact that there was stratification also back then in society, and it still exists today. So when we read a text like Galatians 3, there is neither no longer Jew or Greek. There's no longer slave or free. There's no longer male or female. All of you are one in Christ Jesus. What exactly is Paul getting at when he's writing this, right? And this then sort of speaks back to that text in 1 Corinthians 14. If what Paul is saying is that in Christ, in this new way of living and being, right, this idea of dying to the old and being resurrected, having a change of mind, right, maybe this new way of being flies in the face of stratification, of traditional stratification within society, and attempts to eradicate or resist that compulsion, the impetus to try to put a certain group of people over another so that one might benefit and the other would not, to the detriment of another group, or the discrimination and oppression of another group. So we'll continue to think about this more as we look at the other text coming up.